The first trip to the North Pole may have been done in an airship. It sounds like something out of steampunk, but it became a reality thanks to Norwegian daring, Italian engineering, American money, and a bunch of potentially lost or lying explorers. This is the story of the Airship Norge. Let's explore. The story begins in 1925, when the Italian airship designer Umberto Nobile gets a telegram. It's from Roald Amundsen, the Norwegian explorer who led the first expeditions to cross the Northwest Passage and to reach the South Pole. Amundsen has just returned from a failed attempt to reach the North Pole by seaplane and wants to meet Nobile in Oslo. In Oslo, Amundsen reveals to Nobile his newest plan, to use one of Nobile's airships to make the first crossing of the Arctic from Europe to Alaska via the North Pole. Nobile says this is great, this is a cool idea, and he'll get the next airship he's building ready for a flight to the Arctic. But Amundsen wants to leave as soon as the next Arctic spring, so eventually they agree to modify one of Nobile's existing airships, the N1, for the journey. At the time, while both men think this is a daring feat, neither thinks it will be the first journey to reach the North Pole. Both Frederick Cook in 1908 and Robert Peary in 1909 claimed to have reached the pole on foot. Both claims were debated, but the consensus soon became that Cook didn't have enough evidence to prove that he reached the pole, especially after an independent review by the University of Copenhagen came to that conclusion. For Peary's part, his papers were verified by the National Geographic Society, but they weren't exactly unbiased as they were a major sponsor of the expedition. Nevertheless, Peary was recognized by the U.S. Congress as the first to the pole, quietly overlooking the fact that African-American Matthew Henson was the first member of the expedition to actually reach the claimed site of the pole. Many modern historians, including explorer Wally Herbert, who reached the pole on foot in 1969, doubt that either expedition actually reached the pole at all, either through error or deliberate fraud, noting for instance that the diary entry where Peary says "pole at last" was written on a loose slip of paper rather than directly into the journal. Thus, it may well be that the North Pole remained unreached when the airship N1 was ready to depart. So now it's spring 1926, and the N1 has been modified with a smaller cabin and windows made of celluloid instead of glass, all in a bid to lighten the airship for its polar journey. The Aero Club of Norway buys the airship from the Italian government with the funding of Lincoln Ellsworth, an American polar explorer who accompanied Amundsen on his failed seaplane journey, and who is, conveniently, the heir to a coal mining fortune. The airship is rechristened Norge, meaning Norway in Norwegian, and is handed over to the polar explorers in a ceremony in Rome personally attended by Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. Norge sets out for the Norwegian Arctic archipelago of Svalbard, making stops in Leningrad and the Norwegian town of Vadsø. In Svalbard, the final crew is assembled, including Amundsen, Nobile, Ellsworth, 13 other crew, and Nobile's dog Titina. From an engineering standpoint, Norge was a semi-rigid airship, meaning that it lay somewhere between a blimp supported only by the pressure of its lifting gas, and a zeppelin supported entirely by an internal structure. It had a cruising speed of around 50 to 55 miles per hour, or 80 to 90 kilometers per hour, enough to achieve the Arctic crossing in about 4 days. The airship was 348 feet or 106 meters long, and 85 feet or 26 meters wide. It was filled with hydrogen, which had the advantage over helium of being lighter, cheaper, and not literally illegal to export from the United States, the only commercial source of helium at the time, under the Helium Act of 1925. Now, hydrogen had the disadvantage of being flammable, but Nobile was willing to overlook that in light of the whole possible to get thing. Back in Svalbard, the airship's crew is preparing for the crossing when a second aircraft takes off from the very same island. This is an airplane piloted by American naval aviators Richard Byrd and Floyd Bennett, and on May 9, 1926, they set out to fly over the pole just a few days before Norge would. They returned to Svalbard later the same day, claiming success. Again, though, modern historians are skeptical, since if the logs are to be believed, the plane would have somehow had to cross a 1,535-mile distance to the pole and back during a flight just under 16 hours, with an 85-mile-an-hour airspeed, and yeah, that doesn't multiply right. Now, since that's an airspeed rather than a ground speed, it's technically possible if there was a tailwind both ways, but there were also some erased navigational readings in the logbook, so the claim is somewhat suspect. In any case, after congratulating Byrd and Bennett on an apparently successful flight, the crew of the Norge takes off the morning of May 11, 1926. Several hours into the flight, the left engine shuts down entirely. Thankfully, since they're in an airship rather than a plane, they just sort of hang out in the sky for an hour or so while the crew finds the problem, which turns out to be ice in a fuel line, and gets the engine going again. A few hours after that, the airship gets caught in a snow shower and begins to ice over, so Nobile commands the crew to ascend above the clouds where the sun can melt the ice off. Continuing to the pole, Amundsen records that the entire track of the ship is over frozen ocean, with no undiscovered islands in their path. At 1:25 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time on May 12th, the airship reaches the North Pole itself at an altitude of 150 meters, making Amundsen and fellow crewman Oscar Wisting the first people to have reached both the North and South Poles, and potentially making the entire crew first to successfully reach the North Pole at all, in the not all too unlikely event that the 3 previous journeys each missed the mark somehow. The ship drops the flags of Norway, Italy, and the United States onto the ice of the pole. Amundsen and Ellsworth are annoyed to discover that Nobile has made the Italian flag bigger than the other 2. Departing the pole for Alaska, the Norge fights its way through the weather for 2 more days. The propellers keep flinging chunks of ice through the hull's fabric, requiring constant repairs. Nobile recounts that the ship's radio broke down, and that Byrd offered to lead a search for the airship in his plane. Thankfully, the airship reaches the Inuit village of Teller, Alaska on the 14th, and radios the outside world. Because of the weather, the crew decides to deflate the airship in Teller, instead of continuing to the larger town of Nome, their original destination. After 71 hours, the first flight across the Arctic is complete. After the flight, Nobile is touted by the Italian government as a national hero, despite his uneasy relationship with the fascist Italian government. Amundsen and Nobile's relationship is strained over who should get credit for the journey, as well as the flag thing, and the Italian government sending Nobile on a speaking tour of the US doesn't help things. In Amundsen's 1927 autobiography, he goes out of his way to criticize Nobile in a chapter on Norge. In other news, Lincoln Ellsworth is named as an honorary Boy Scout, and he'd later go on to lead some expeditions to Antarctica in the 1930s. In 1928, Nobile has another airship ready, this one named Italia, meaning Italy in Italian. He sets out with a new crew on a series of 3 flights around the Arctic. On the way back from the North Pole on the 3rd flight on May 25th, the airship crashes, but several of the crew survive and radio for help, sparking an international search and rescue effort. Putting aside his conflict with Nobile, Amundsen flies to Svalbard to assist, again funded by Ellsworth's coal money, but the plane never reaches its destination and disappears into the Arctic with Amundsen aboard. For his part, Nobile is picked up by a Swedish plane on June 23rd, despite his protests that his crewmates should be rescued first. Eventually, the other survivors and some rescue pilots who had become stranded as well are saved by icebreakers. Whether Norge was the first to reach the North Pole or not, it was certainly an incredible journey. The voyage was well recorded, and not only reached the pole, but successfully crossed the entire Arctic Ocean and charted one of the last unknown portions of the surface of the globe. And though it's not definitely certain, the fact that it's even reasonably likely that an airship made the first successful voyage to the North Pole just makes the world that much more exciting. And as always, thanks for watching.